Hello guys, welcome to another video. In this video, I will be explaining about Azure functions. We'll try and cover as much as we can about Azure functions. So what exactly is Azure functions? Like just to give a simple example, everyone knows about AWS Lambda. So when any event happens, we want some code to trigger, then we go with AWS Lambda, right? For suppose if the file is dropped, for suppose if an entry has arrived in our database, then we want to do something. For suppose if someone has pushed the code to our GitHub repo, and if you want to send an email, anything to do any kind of action when some other thing has happened, some other event has happened, so we go with the AWS Lambda. Similarly, it's a similar service like AWS Lambda here in Azure. We call it as Azure Functions. So it's a serverless completely and a event driven code without managing servers or the infrastructure. Just whenever an event happens, just run the code without worrying about the infrastructure. So functions are small, same like AWS Lambda, and they say stateless too. But normal Azure functions are stateless, but we have Azure durable functions which are stateful. That means the information from one Azure functions can be passed to other Azure functions. For suppose if you have set a variable in one function and if you want to use it in another function, which you can do using Azure durable functions, which I'll explain in the next video, where we can create workflows using Azure durable functions. But here it's completely stateless. Azure basic Azure functions are stateless. If you see each Azure function app, like if you go to a Azure portal, so if we go to a function app, first we have to create one function app, and inside which we can have any number of Azure functions. That's what it means. So each function app contains one or more functions. Each function has exactly one trigger that causes it to run. There should be one event which should make it run. If you see here, triggers pass the event data into the function. For suppose if an entry has come into the database, for suppose if a file has arrived in the blob storage, then if you want to know the file name, if you want to read the file content, if you want to know the entry which has arrived in the database, so all that information can also be accessed inside this Azure functions using triggers. And the next thing which we need to know here is bindings. Triggers is what makes the Azure functions run, and the bindings is what makes the Azure function to connect with other services. Like for suppose if you want to write the data into a database, if you want to store the file into some other storage container, instead of from the container which we have received the file, all those can be done using bindings. If you see the meaning of the bindings, like how it is binded, so we can bind this Azure function with other services to make them work together. So bindings provide declarative connection to external resources as input or output without hard coding service calls. For example, one function might trigger on HTTPS request. So let's say if we have triggered Azure function using HTTP request, and if you want to write the data into some blob storage, we can do that using bindings. So these are the two main concepts which we need to be aware: triggers and bindings. Triggers is what makes Azure function run and which will bring on the information into the Azure function, and bindings is what Azure function is going to return or write or connect to some other service. So now let's first see the triggers. So as we know, triggers is nothing but how and when the function is invoked. There can be multiple types of triggers. Like for suppose it's an HTTP request, we can have an unique URL for our Azure functions, and we can trigger with the HTTP URL as well, or we can trigger when a file has arrived, or we can trigger when a blob has arrived. There are multiple ways. If you see the documentation, if you come to this place, triggers and bindings, see, we can even trigger the Azure functions with Azure Cache for Redis. I mean, we can trigger our Azure functions when we have an entry into Cosmo DB as well, Data Explorer, with MySQL, with OpenAI, with SQL, with blob storage, with event hubs, whenever we are with HTTP and webhooks, and whenever the event or when the data is pushed to Kafka topics, and with the queue storage as well, RabbitMQ, all these services can be integrated. How are we integrating all this? Using bindings. So in this tutorial, we'll see on how to trigger the Azure functions using blob storage and HTTPS trigger. So now if you come back here, and I'll just explain you the code. This is how the piece of code will be there inside the Azure functions. We are just declaring the function here, app. That's it. At the rate app.function name we'll declare here, and app.root. This particular decorator is used when you want to trigger the Azure functions using the HTTPS. So now we'll have a URL, right? URL/API/allow. If you execute that, then this piece of code from this HTTPS will be triggered. And for suppose if you want to trigger the Azure function when a file has arrived, if you see blob trigger here, for HTTPS we are using root decorator, and for file has arrived into blob we are using .blob trigger. And in case if you want to upload the file into another blob, then we use app.blob upload, and we'll give the output file name and all everything. We'll see that. So this is how we are invoking the Azure functions. One is using HTTP, another is using the blob. And now if you see, I'm just explaining the same piece of code here. If you see app.function name, this is how we declare the function name. This is used to when you want to trigger Azure function using HTTP and the function name. And if you want to trigger using the blob, then we use this particular decorator. And similarly, we'll have separate decorator for SQL DB and for Kafka, for Event Hub, Event Grid and everything. And now if we go ahead and create a project in Visual Studio, we'll understand what exactly is the host.json, what exactly is the local settings.json, what is requirements.txt, which we know we have to declare all the dependencies here. So let's look at the complete Azure functions code, each and every file now here. Okay, let me close this. Let's create a new folder. So if you come to function documentation, and if you come to quick starts, and if you come to Visual Studio Code, we can clearly see what and all the things which we need to have in our system to work with Azure functions. Okay, first you need to create an Azure subscription, which is fine. Then we have to have Python installed in our system, which is fine. Then we have to have Visual Studio, which is fine. And then we can install Python extension, and then Azure function extension and Azurite extension. These two are the things which we need to do. So now if you come here, and if you go to marketplace extensions, and then if you click on Azure functions, if you see I have installed it. You have to install this, and the next is Azurite. These Azure functions help us to create Azure functions locally and run and everything. And while running, in case if you want to have an environment like Azure, then that is being done using this Azurite. It kind of gives the environment for our functions to run in the local system. So these two are the things which we need to install. That's it. If you can just search it and you can find it, and then you can install them. That's it. And the next important thing is we need to have the core tools. So how do we install the core tools? So if we just go to this particular documentation, if it's a Mac OS, we have to just install it using the brew command. See, if you see here, we have this brew tap Azure function, brew install this one. If we install, we'll get the core tools installed in our system. We can just copy it and execute, which I already have done. See, if you see, we already have it installed and up to date. So we got this particular warning. That's it. So this is how, these are the few mandatory things which we need to have in our local system to develop our work or execute the Azure functions. So now if you come here to Visual Studio, and when you click on Ctrl+Shift+P, we have to click on this one, Azure functions, create new project. That's it. It will ask all the details. The folder it needs to use is func6, which is very much fine. I want it in a Python environment, which is fine. And then what kind of function I want. See, all these are the basic triggers. Like Azure function works on two things. One is trigger and bindings. Trigger is how the Azure function has to trigger, right? So let's see both. First, let's see the HTTP trigger. Then we'll see the blob trigger as well. So HTTP trigger, what is the name of the Azure function you want? Azure HTTP trigger YT. So as it's a HTTP trigger, anyone whoever has the access to that URL can trigger, right? So you want it to have an admin access, or you want it to be anonymous, or you want it to be function. Let's use the function for now. So it just creates the whole setup for our Azure function. This we can directly push it to our Azure portal as well, which we'll see in few minutes. But for now, this is how the project Azure functions code has been created in the Visual Studio. So if you see, if you come to host.json, so this host.json acts as a configuration file for our Azure functions, where we have to give the information like logging, when it has to time out, that setting we can give. And if you see here, extension bundles, that means this is what will enable the triggers and bindings in our Azure function. So it's like a configuration file. and the requirements.json is like in our virtual environment which gets created. Whatever we want to install will be installed using this requirements.txt file. And if you see here, right now we have only Azure functions. In case if you want to use Azure blob storage, we have to use Azure blob storage, Azure-blob storage. That particular package will also get installed as we are accessing the Azure blob storage. And next comes the local.settings.json. For suppose if you see Azure web job storage which is empty, in case if you are using a blob storage, which we will see in few minutes, we have to give the connection details in this local.settings.json file. And what kind of environment? It's a Python environment. So this kind of information stores in this locals.settings.json. For HTTPS, we will not have to worry much, the local settings.json file. But for blob storage, we have to give that Azure container access key here, so that our code, so that this function app will read from this local.setting.json file and try to access the blob storage. That's it. Now if you see, as I already explained, app.rule, this particular decorator is helping us to execute the Azure functions with the HTTP trigger whenever this particular URL has been triggered, which we'll invoke and show you. And this is a piece of code. This is a logging, and if there is any name passed, that name, and it's just doing a simple Python stuff here. That's it. So now if you come to Azure functions, see local project functions, if you see start debugging to update the list. So when I click on this, it is setting up the environment using the virtual network. Or else if you want to manually start, you can use func start space func, then that also triggers the Azure functions. So now what happened is I got this particular error. So what I've done is I came to this host.json and I just added this particular parameter and saved it. And again I came to Azure function and I clicked on this button and I clicked here twice. Now this particular function is running. So now if I take this URL and if I execute it in the browser, see Azure function got executed. Now if you see Python HTTP, now let's execute this again. See, again it got executed. So this is how we can trigger Azure function using HTTPS as well. The error we faced is somehow when I created this Azure function in Visual Studio, this particular value was missing. Once I added, the error got resolved and I am able to execute this Azure function. So now let's close this and now let's execute the blob trigger. And then after that we'll see on how to upload this Azure function or how to commit this code directly into Azure portal as well. So now let me close this. Let me go here. I'll create func7. Now if I come here again, if I open this func7 here, that's it. So now we know to create an Azure function, Control-Shift-P, create new project. That's it, func7, Python based, Python 3 virtual environment. Now I want to use blob trigger based. So blob trigger YT is what I want to give the function name. That's it. Now it is asking the path within the storage account that the trigger will monitor. So I'll go and to my Azure portal and I'll give my container name here, so that when a file arrives in a container, it has to copy in some other container. Let's do that. So now if I go to Azure portal, so function app, I have this function app inside. Sorry, I should not go. I should go to storage account. I need a storage account name. This is the storage account, and here what is the container name? Let me open any container. So this CPR container is a container I want to use, and inside which I'll have this test.txt file. So now if I come here, and this is the container name I want to give. That's it. Create a new local app setting. Yes. Local app setting is used by the Azure function to get the details in case if it has to connect to our Azure portal. So now if you see you want to use Azure emulator for the local storage, no, we'll just directly use the remote Azure storage only from the portal. That's it. Now it is asking for the storage account. Right now I have this particular storage account. If I come back here inside the storage account, I have Praveen storage account. That is what I wanted to use. That's it. So now local dot settings dot json will have my access key, so that this Azure function in my local can access to that storage account. So if I go here, if you see, this is the account name and the account key. This is how our Azure function will be able to access my storage account. Okay, and we know host.json, again it will fail because somehow it's not generating the version. But let's execute and run. Let's execute and see. If it fails, then we'll add the version again. That's it. Inside the function app, if you see, before we have root because it was HTTPS based trigger. Now blob trigger, when the file arrives, then trigger. So now here this is the method and I'm just logging, but I want to even upload this into some other storage account, some other container as well, from one container to another container when the file arrives. So for that I have to use another decorator called @app.blob upload. That's it. So now this is where I want to copy. So now if I come to my code and I'll just place it here as a target test.txt, which is fine. The connection details it has to get from local settings.json using this particular key. That is what we have given, which is fine for the trigger, this one, and for the bindings, which means to copy into the target. Now we gave the output binding here in this piece of line, but we have to copy it. How do we copy it? Using this particular argument. Now this particular argument should also change. One is the my blob, which is the input which we got from the trigger. If you see here, my blob. Similarly, we have to pass another argument for this as well, which is output blob. So let's change that to like this. So now we can paste this. So blob content is reading from my blob and uploading it in the output blob. Output blob is this one, and we are binding it with the another container. That's it. So now let's say save it, and we know we can come to here Azure functions, and then we can make sure if it's running this function, start debugging mode. If double click it starts. Once it's ready, if you see, again we got the same error because we did not add the version. Let's go ahead and add the function version. So now come here, go to host.json, put a comma. That's it. Now again come to Azure functions, then click on this. Now if you come here, now it is running without. So now if you see, when I try to start again, I am getting this particular error. SAS connection URI for blob storage. Please provide at least one of these if you intend to use the files for secret. Add an app setting key Azure web job secret storage type with value files. So now if you come to here, this web job storage is empty string. So let's just copy this one and paste it here, the same value again, and let's try to start it again. Let's see if it fails this time. Now the blob trigger is running. Previously we saw the version is missing, which is one thing in the host.json. The version is missing, which we added, and again in the local setting.json we have to add the same storage connection details in the Azure web job storage as well, because our piece of code is accessing this particular variable only, but internally some Azure code is Azure functions code is internally, some of the modules are accessing in this particular key to get the connection of a specific storage account. So which is why we have to paste this one as well. So now let's see the same, and let's expand this. Now let me upload a file. So now let me go here, go to my storage account, containers, the source container, CPR container. That's it. Let me upload a file here again with this the same file. Overwrite if the same file exists, and come here, downloads, test.txt, and the file should be copied into other container. Okay, now if we come here, let's see if the function executes. See the function executed, copy completed successfully. That's what we got. Now if I go to the code, that is the log we have kept. And now if I go to other container, CPR target container, see it came 2:15 just now, which is the time now. See, that's it. So this is how the blob event happens in Azure functions. We saw both. In the next video we will see what is the Azure durable functions with some SQL trigger, not just the blob or HTTP trigger. Now we saw on how to trigger. Now if you come to Azure functions, function app, if you come to this function app, and if you see there is no functions deployed here, right? So this is my old function. No functions were deployed in my Azure. How do you deploy the functions which you developed locally into your Azure portal, which we will see now? So now if you come here, the VS Code, there are one ideal way which you can do using CI/CD is once you come here and once you come to deployment, once you come to deployment center, here you can give access to your GitHub. If you see right now I have given access to my GitHub. Let me disconnect it completely, and I'll try to, in case if your code is in the repo, we can even bring from here. If you see GitHub and then your organization, what is the repo in your GitHub which you want to select, and the branch if you select, that is the ideal way. Or else the second way is like you can directly push it from the Visual Studio Code as well. So now if you come to overview, so now if you come to Studio Code, if you come here and if you do right click on this local project, right click, deploy to Azure. So select the function with what is the function. See, this is the only function app we have. So into this function app we want to deploy. If you see, the deployment configuration is being loading. So this is how we can directly even push from the Visual Studio Code, or else you can use the CI/CD using this particular deployment center. So now if you come here, it is asking to deploy. Yes, if you deploy, see now the deploy is being done. And now if we go to our Azure portal, once this is done, we can see this particular blob trigger YT in our Azure function app. See in Azure, which is done. So now if you come here and now if you come to overview, see blob trigger YT which just came. This is our Azure functions which we created in our local. It has come here. Now if you see, it will be only read only. It will load in some time, but it will be read only. We can view the same piece of code whatever we have in our local. See, the same piece of code which we have in our Azure Studio Code has come here. That's it. See the same, this is the last log. That's it. So this is how we can even push the code into Azure portal, but the ideal way is to use the deployment center only. That's it. And the next thing is there are multiple plans which Azure offers in Azure functions. So when we try to create a function app, when you click on this create, we'll get all these options. So let's see what these options are. Okay, so let's see one by one. The first basic one is a consumption plan. Like here it is like pay as you go service. Like right now I'm using this consumption plan only. So here if you see, it's like just pay only when your function runs, ideal for small and occasional workloads. Okay, and the next function is like a flex consumption plan. In the above, we can't choose our own CPU and all. It by default decides the CPU and all, and there is no virtual network and all those things. But here in the next plan we can have the desired CPUs and we can have the private network and everything. And the next are the premium plans, app service plan and the container app plan. Here it is always ready, no waiting to start, run many functions together, grow automatically when busy, costs but handles heavy workloads. It is used like for the real-time systems like event hubs and all. And the next is the app service plan. Here if you see, In the container app plan, it's for the containers. Like in case if you want to have your code in the Docker, then we can use this container app plan. And in the app service plan, in case if you have some websites running on Azure, then we can use that along with this Azure functions. You can share this with this app service. There is another service in Azure called app service, right? You can share both the Azure functions and app service in this plan. Thank you so much for watching. In the next video, I'll explain what is Azure durable functions with the SQL trigger. That's it. Thank you so much.